We started off our Advent journey a couple of weeks ago by asking what we love most about Christmas. Probably the most common response I got, particularly from younger people or from children, was of course presents. Presents are an integral and a vital part of our Christmas celebrations. Just to illustrate, could you imagine celebrating Christmas without the exchange of gifts, without giving or receiving presents? To be honest with you, I couldn't. I could not imagine what it would be like to celebrate the birth of Jesus without giving or exchanging gifts of one kind or another. Which is why this time of year we get so much of this stuff. This is the amount of advertising material, also known as junk mail, which we got in our letterbox one day this week. An absolute mountain of stuff. And in here we see a whole lot of things that people are suggesting that we buy for people that we know as presents. And so there are perfumes, fragrances from the chemist. There's lots of yummy food that we could eat. There are car parts, other things, lights, hammock or a swing chair. Oh look, there's so much stuff that we could go through and we could buy for people in one way or another. And so a lot of the emphasis of this time of year is on buying presents to give to other people, or else maybe asking people for gifts that we'd like to give them. And so last week we talked about the idea of spending less, of actually intentionally reducing the amount of money that we spend at this time of year to try to keep ourselves out of a hole of debt, but also to help us think about what's most important, not just to get caught up in the superficial exchange of things that we don't need and possibly don't even want, but actually to think a little bit deeper about not only the amount of money that we spend, because it's not just about the money, but why we give gifts in the first place. And so I asked our children, so why do we give presents at Christmas? Why do we exchange gifts at this time of year? And they answered correctly. Very proud of our children. They answered that, we give gifts because it represents the gift that God gives to us in his Son. And so God gives Jesus to us. And so as a way of celebrating that and remembering that, we give gifts to each other, which makes sense. And like I said, I'm very pleased that our children can give us what some might think of being the correct Christian answer for why we celebrate Jesus' birth by exchanging gifts with each other. But in this third week of the Advent conspiracy, as we think about what it means to give more, I'd like us to pause and reflect not just on the number of gifts that we give, but the quality of gifts that we give. So it's not just about quantity, it is about the quality of gifts that we give. Now, when I introduce the Advent conspiracy to people, they get a bit confused by 1 week talking about spending less and the second week or the week after talking about giving more, because we have such a close connection in our brains, in our minds, in the way we think about Christmas, that we equate giving with spending, which is a bit of a tragedy. And again, one of the reasons why I like the Advent conspiracy is it challenges us to actually make a distinction between the amount we spend and the gifts that we give. Because we don't need to spend a lot of money to give to people. One of the ways we can understand God's gift to us of his Son at Christmas was that he's giving to us in a relational way, right? He's not just buying us something off the shelf, but he's giving himself to us in a very personal, a very relational way. So the gift of Jesus is actually the gift of God's self to us, so that God is a part of our lives and God is intimately connected with everything that goes on. And so one way in which we can think about the Advent conspiracy, and this is one of the major themes in the Advent conspiracy book or material, is that whole idea of not just giving stuff or giving things, but giving of ourselves relationally, thinking about how we can give to each other in a meaningful way to actually strengthen that relationship and celebrate that relationship and make that relationship stronger. And so in the comment section of this video, I'll leave a link for you to have a look at some of the ways in which the Advent conspiracy suggests that we give of ourselves relationally to each other. Not just giving stuff, like I said, but actually investing in each other in relational ways so that we can have strong relationships and good relationships and positive relationships. But I kind of this year, I want to take it that next step further, because what I'm kind of finding is that we can talk about the idea of God giving God's self to us. But what does that mean? How does that look? What is God actually giving us when he gives us Jesus? Because we can talk about the presence of God in our lives, but there's a whole lot of good that comes along with that. And so what I want to do today is actually dig down a little bit deeper and think, well, when God gives himself to us, gives more of himself to us in Jesus, what comes along with that? What does God give us with the gift of his Son? And to do that, I'd like to have a look at Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 to 4, and then verses 8 to 11. Now, this is the Old Testament reading in the Revised Common Lectionary for the third Sunday of Advent this year. So this is the Old Testament reading for this Sunday. I'm just going to read the first part. So Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 to 4. Isaiah writes, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be set free. He sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favour has come, and with it, the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. They will rebuild the ancient ruins, repairing cities destroyed long ago. They will revive them, though they've been deserted for many generations." So originally, Isaiah is talking to the people of Israel who've been exiled, and there's this promise that they will return to their homeland, or God will bring them back to the homeland to rebuild what had been destroyed. Those of you who might know the Bible well, though, the first couple of verses might sound familiar, because there's a story in Luke's Gospel, right at the start of Luke's Gospel, when Jesus is beginning his ministry. He goes into a synagogue and he opens the scroll of Isaiah and he reads these words about bringing good news for the poor, about bringing comfort to the brokenhearted, and about bringing release for captives and setting prisoners free. And Jesus, at the end of the story, he rolls up the scroll and he puts it down and he says, "Today these words have been fulfilled in your presence." What Jesus is saying is that here's the fulfillment of these words of Isaiah, written 500 or 600 years before the birth of Jesus. He is the one who actually makes this come about, who makes this a reality, because the Spirit of the Lord is upon Jesus, which we see at his baptism, and he comes as the Son of God, as the eternal Word of God made human. He comes to give himself to us, but as he gives himself to us as God's anointed Saviour, he brings all of the goodness of God with him to provide for us in our need. And so when we start to break apart this passage from Isaiah 61, we find that there are a lot of people Jesus is promising through this, or God is promising through this, to actually provide our needs through the person of Jesus. And so he talks about people who are poor receiving good news. We can think about being poor in a number of different ways. We might think about being in financial poverty, or maybe even having a massive debt after our Christmas spending spree. But we can think about people who are financially poor, but we can also experience spiritual poverty. In other words, an emptiness of our heart and of our soul, or that feeling that we don't have anything good in us, or we don't have anything good to offer people. And so being poor might not just mean what's in our bank account, might also mean having nothing in our hearts and minds that we consider to be good, or other people might consider valuable. And so God is saying that through the gift of Jesus, he's actually giving us good news, that we can participate in the riches of God and everything that means. And then he goes on to explain some more. He talks about bringing comfort for the brokenhearted. Now, there are lots of things in life that can break our hearts. But the message of Jesus and the gift that God gives to us through Jesus is comfort. That when our hearts are broken, God's heart breaks with us and for us. And again, he provides for our needs. he talks about bringing release for captives. Now, there are lots of things that can make us captive in our lives. We can be captive to fear, to doubt, to shame, to anxiety. A whole lot of things can kind of trap us in our lives. And so what Jesus is promising here is that when he comes to us, he actually comes to give us release from those things. So they don't have dominion over us, they don't have control over us, but we can live a life that is free from the fear or the doubts or the worries or the anxiety that might imprison us or hold us captive. Isaiah promises that God's anointed one, that the one who carries the Spirit, will come to bring freedom for prisoners. Now, there are a whole lot of different ways that people understand this, but again, thinking about being prisoners in our hearts and minds, there are lots of things that, again, can lock us up. Whether we're talking about addictions, or whether we're talking about mental illnesses, or a whole range of different things in our lives can hold us prisoner. And what God's gift to us is, through the gift of Jesus, is freedom from those things. So again, they don't define us, they don't control us, they don't lord it over us, but we can actually find freedom from those things. And then he talks about those who mourn. And look, we all suffer losses of different kinds, and we can all mourn those losses. And so it might be talking about someone who has lost someone in their life, someone who has died, that they are grieving for. And here Jesus gives us the hope of the resurrection, which can help us cope with that mourning. But we can lose lots of different things in our lives, and we can mourn those things in our lives. And so the promise of God is that through the gift of Jesus, he gives us the gift of his favor, or the gift of his grace. There's a very close connection between grace and gift and favor in New Testament and Old Testament languages. But then he also talks about those who mourn, receiving a crown of beauty. It's a celebration thing, or being blessed, receiving blessing from God for those who mourn. And so there are all these, I kind of think of them as smaller gifts that Jesus brings to us as the great gift of God. And what I'd like to encourage you to do is actually to sit down with Isaiah 61, and this is just verses, I think, 1 and 2. Just sit down with them and think, well, where am I in my life? All right? Am I feeling poor and impoverished in one way or another? Is my heart broken for any reason? Am I experiencing being captive to something, or being a prisoner to something, or am I mourning the loss of something? And to sit down and to really think through, so how does the gift of Jesus actually give us good news, or comfort, or release, or freedom, or God's favor, or a crown of beauty, or his blessing in our lives? Because when we can find that, when we can find what God gives us in Jesus, then not only do we have something good for our own hearts and souls and lives, which we can celebrate at Christmas, but we have a good gift to give other people. Because this year I'm thinking about this whole idea of giving more as giving more to others the way that God gives to us. So giving to other people more like Jesus gives to us, not just giving things that maybe we don't want or don't need, but actually giving ourselves relationally in a way that's going to provide for those deeper needs. And so, look, maybe you know someone who is experiencing some sort of poverty in their hearts or in their minds, someone whose heart's been broken, or who are captive or a prisoner to something, or who are mourning a loss. Because when we find the goodness of God in Jesus, when we find those gifts that God gives to us through the gift of his Son for our hearts and our minds and our bodies, then we have a different gift. I'm going to say a more meaningful and a deeper gift to be giving to other people. And we don't just do that at Christmas, we can do that all throughout the year. And that's one of the things I like about the whole give more aspect of Advent Conspiracy. It helps us to look beyond December 25th and to be thinking, how can we not just embody this at Christmas, but at Christmas give something that can last the entire year? And so we can be thinking the same. In our poverty, with our broken hearts, with whatever might be trapping or imprisoning us, whatever we are mourning, to find the gift of God, of comfort, of release, of freedom, of favor, of blessing, of a crown of beauty, and to celebrate that gift that God gives us through Jesus. Part of receiving that gift in faith is then sharing that gift in faith and in love, looking at the people around us and seeing their needs, and recognizing that God actually provides for them through his gift of Jesus, whatever their need may be. And the way he actually brings that gift is through us, is through you. And so you have the opportunity to bring the gift of Christ and all of the gifts that he brings with him. You can give that to the people around you. And so I'd like to help you do that. If you're reading through Isaiah and if you're thinking, yeah, but I can't connect the gift of Jesus with this need in my life, you're welcome to get in touch with me and let me know, because I'd love to help you bring that together so you can find how the gift of Jesus can specifically be good news for you. So that in your life, when you see the people around you, you can give them more in the way that God gives to you. You can share more of God's gifts, God's grace, God's love and God's freedom with them as well. So God keep you in his grace. God keep you in those gifts that he gives to you through the ultimate gift of his Son, Jesus.